Hello everyone. I would like to talk to you about the ethics side of research. You may be a brilliant researcher and have wonderful ideas, but I want to remind us all that people are at the basis of what we are doing when we are researching them. In this presentation, I want to cover some definitions and principles of ethics, and in particular research ethics, and to focus on the ethical issues in studies of existing records, because that's what most operational research focuses on. But in addition, to talk about some ethical issues in other research on human participants, other than just on records or existing data. Then I will tell you a little about the procedures of the Ethics Advisory Group of the International Union Against TB and Lung Disease, and finally, a few readings that we have found helpful that you may too. Now, if you look up the definition of ethical, it has words like principled, fair, right, decent, just. And research ethics essentially aims at protecting the dignity, rights, safety, and well-being of research participants. Essentially, and it's easy to remember, we're talking about respect, beneficence, and justice. Respect for persons in terms of giving them the information they need to make an informed decision about whether or not they will be part of the research in a format that is comprehensible to them. And of course, there are challenges with people who speak languages other than the researchers. And they must have the opportunity to choose what will or will not happen to them. And the emphasis is on voluntariness. Beneficence is a balance between the benefits and the risks. So as many benefits as possible and as few risks as possible. And justice, we think of in terms of who is studied and do those people get any benefits from the study that has been done. A rather comprehensive but a little jargonistic definition of health research, but it does include everything, is any epidemiological, biomedical, social science or activity that includes systematic collection or analysis of data. And this is the crunch, with the aim of generating new knowledge in which human beings are exposed to some kind of process, whether it's an intervention, observation, or whatever as listed there. And where these people may become identifiable as individuals through the collection, preparation, or use of records or materials. Now, health research is not surveillance, evaluation, program audit, or patient management. They have their own ethical implications, but we don't consider those as part of specific research. And the reason that all this happened, and quite recently really in terms of world history, was because of some really dreadful atrocities that took place in the 20th century that became very known to everyone. First of all, the Nuremberg experiments, where people had dreadful things done to them without their consent, and they incurred death and permanent disability. And this, of course, was during the Second World War. And resulting from that was one of the first ethics documents, the Nuremberg Code, in 1948. Another example of a what we now look back on as a dreadful study, was a large number of African American men with syphilis diagnosed and identified, who were followed to look at the natural progression of this disease and not given the treatment that was known to cure them. And this experiment took place over a number of years, 40 years, in the mid-20th century, until it stopped, or was stopped, in 1972. And there are other studies that have been slightly risque, particularly on STD, HIV, which are very sensitive areas. And so the result of public opinion, and particularly ethics opinion, were a number of documents. And first was the Nuremberg Code, which emphasized that voluntary consent of the human subject is essential. Then the World Medical Association in 1964 promulgated the Declaration of Helsinki, because I happened to meet at Helsinki that year. This is revised on a regular basis, the last in 2014, and a document is entitled Ethical Principles for Medical Research Involving Human Subjects. And it certainly bears looking at by all researchers. More recently was the Belmont Report from the United States, Ethical Principles and Guidelines for the Protection of Human Subjects of Research. And there are others. One that we find useful and helpful is the CIOMS, Council for International Organizations of Medical Science, relatively recent in the 1990s, and constantly reviewed. There are two documents that come out of that. The Council of Europe produced a document called the Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine. The NIH in the United States has documents that talk about ethical guidance for research in developing countries. And many countries have their own specific country documents. I've mentioned there India, Uganda, South Africa. There are others that have documents. Now, ethics committees essentially are groups of people formulated in different areas of people who are independent of researchers and sponsors. And they are composed of people with an interest in and experience of ethical issues, the pitfalls, and some of the solutions. They should be functional in health departments, but they aren't always. Some somehow get sidelined in the need to produce health services. Many institutions, and we know about the International Union Against TB and Lung Disease, nearly all universities and other institutions have ethics committees. And some NGOs, notably MSF in our context and others, have ethics committees. Let's have a look specifically then at studies of existing records. And you may wonder what the ethical issues could be. Well, first of all, is study design. Poor science is poor ethics. And there are a number of aspects around the study design that can, of course, be sorted out by an adequate pilot study. Maybe the data is not available, maybe the sample size is too small, maybe not enough time has been left, whatever the science. If this is not sorted out, then the study has used resources wrongly. The study must be justifiable. Has it already been done? are we wasting resources and time and people's goodwill in doing it all over again? Maybe the topic is not a priority. And you may ask, to whom? Well, to the community, to program managers, or to researchers. Maybe it's just an idea that somebody had. Permission. It's critical that permission is obtained from the relative people, be they district managers, hospital managements, institutional heads, directors, facility staff. And this, of course, needs to be in writing, so it can be provided to those who need to know. Now, what about this aspect of community engagement that is so often ignored? Communities need to be consulted to give them information, get their permission, and to involve them at the level of study planning. One shouldn't just arrive in a community and start digging around records, asking questions, without people knowing what's being done. At the other end of the study, when the results are available, it's very important and ethical to disseminate and discuss those results with relevant community leaders and members. Even if it is a study of records and existing data, people have the right to know. Benefit is usually very indirect in studies of records. But in some cases, it may be possible to follow up a problem situation. An example, an HIV-positive neonate has not been given the appropriate antiretroviral treatment. A diagnosed patient with resistant TB is not on treatment, and the records clearly state that. Of course, the operative word is may, because these sorts of studies are very often retrospective, so it may be virtually impossible to find those people again. But one must always consider any benefit that can be done, and certainly to do no harm to individuals whose records are studied or to their communities. Termed non-maleficence. The other very important thing in record studies is confidentiality. And names of individuals should not be collected unless it's essential. It may be essential if one is doing cross-referencing with other records, for example, laboratory records. As far as possible, one should replace names with study numbers. And the results of identifiable individuals should not be accessible to anyone except the principal investigator and selected named researchers. Now, very often we will pull in voluntary or perhaps paid people from the community to help look through records and collect data. And if they are members of a community, there is always the potential that they may assign a name to a particular record and realize that this person has a certain condition, and that may have bad implications. So a confidentiality agreement is a good way of trying to ensure that this does not happen, and to formalize an educational process to explain to these people that everything they collect is confidential. Not collecting names of individuals may not always protect confidentiality. So in certain situations, where there are small numbers of people, where the name of the health facility where they have attended is named, one has to think carefully. It doesn't always ensure confidentiality. And all documents, all data, collecting with data from the records, should be safely and securely stored. either hard copies locked or password protected electronic versions. So confidentiality is a very important part of ethical management of research. Reporting results. Research is not complete and is unethical unless the results are provided to those who need to know. And I touched on this before when we talked about community engagement. And who needs to know? Well, the people whose records have been looked at. Maybe it's back in some time ago, but the community who live in that same area do have a right to know, and there may be results that impinge on their health behaviors, and they ought to be given the results. Certainly health authorities, so that they can take any due action, and the scientific community. And of course most researchers will gun for that one, because to publish in a journal, present at a conference is a good thing to do. And of course funders and sponsors usually make their own demands, but they need to have the results as well. It's no good referring a community group in the middle of Tanzania to an article in The Lancet. That would not be the appropriate format for people. For some it may be, but one has to produce these summaries of results in an appropriate format. Another ethical principle is the application of results. And in operational research, the whole aim is policy and practice change if this is shown to be beneficial, if whatever is being studied draws some deficiency to light. And researchers should facilitate this and support and monitor the process. Collaboration and co-authorship, sometimes rather touchy subjects, but they shouldn't be, and they need to be planned carefully ahead of time. It's ethical to involve all those who contributed to studies. And in operational research, we do emphasize the special need to include policymakers and program leaders and try to involve them in the collaboration and co-authorship, because any policy change is best made when somebody has been part of a study. And of course the STROBE, or Centre for Operational Research mentors, should also be involved because they have worked to take the study to completion. Local ethics approval. Many countries, sadly not all, have local ethics committees. And we believe quite firmly that a committee on the spot in the country that's been where the study is taking place should have an opportunity to review and approve studies, because they know and understand local conditions. The ethics group of the International Union emphasizes this need for local ethics approval for every study, unless, of course, there are reasons why it's not possible to get this. And it is clear that there are situations where it is not impossible. There are countries where there are no ethics committees. There are countries that have ethics committees which only review applications for other types of study other than operational research, for example, for randomized controlled trials. There are sometimes extensive delays in reviews, and the committee may meet once a year or twice a year. And there are instances of corruption where approval is given for payment or in exchange for authorship. So we are well aware it's not always possible. So much for studies of records. What about while we are talking about research ethics in general, studies that involve human participants directly. One always has to consider possible risks, which include physical issues, complications, side effects, breach of confidentiality, stigmatization, psychological stress, possible drug resistance as a result of the study, or infection of other people. And remembering our principle of beneficence, or not doing harm, one has to consider what interventions are being used. Are these tests, drugs, procedures, environmental changes? Or perhaps they are questions. And a question itself can do harm. And there should be adequate planning taking into account the sensitivity of people in terms of cultures, beliefs, traditions, and attitudes. And these are very often locally specific, and it's up to researchers to study those and determine what is sensitive. Respect for people's rights and times and privacy. And very often studies in developing countries have to take particular cognizance of this, because people are very often not in the habit of considering their own rights and their own time. So the researcher has to be careful to consider this. There are people who don't make demands, as they may in developed countries. And there should be no extra cost incurred by research participants. This may be in terms of travel to where the research is taking place, extra facility visits, not routine visits, of course, but any extra visits required by the researchers, loss of earnings through research visits, payment of replacements, for example, child minding, or whatever. People should not have to incur those costs, and these should be paid out to them. Then, what about the very important issue of informed, or some people say it's better to call it understood consent? And an information sheet needs to be provided and preferably read out as well, both given to people and read out in a language and style that can be understood. And as researchers, we often use undue jargon and excessive length. So we need to try and summarize and put it in simple terms. And to go through some of the issues within informed consent that we would suggest, people need to know exactly what the study is about. Who will do what, when, why, and how? And what are the possible benefits and risks? Why are you, that is, this individual participant, being asked? People may say, well, what have I done wrong? What is bad about me, or what's unique about me? They deserve to know why they're being invited. And what exactly will they be asked to do? Will there be any benefits? Will there be any risks? Assurance that their names will not be divulged, that they are free to refuse completely or at any stage. If any recordings, either visual or auditory, are to be taken, these must be stated and specific consent for that obtained. And the same for specimens that are stored. Who will get the results? They need to know that. And in what form? Where can you, the study participant, get the results? And a specific indication of how they can get the results. From whom, when, telephone number if possible. Are there any costs for you? Are there any questions? And who can you ask if you think of a question later? Those are essential points in an information sheet. Consent, once people have read the information or it's been read to them, a declaration by the participant, the researcher, and the translator, all of which confirm that the information has been adequate. It's been given, that's been understood, that participation is voluntary, and that it's non-prejudicial. In other words, participating in the research or not participating in the research will have no influence on routine healthcare. That's always important to state. And the researcher should sign the same consent form that the information was given and understood. And in cases where a translator is used, that person should sign that they have explained the study to the person. There are special situations where consent needs to be obtained with great care. And one is in vulnerable groups. And there are a number of vulnerable groups to be considered. And these people deserve to have their consent taken with care. And in different sociocultural contexts, there are different standards and norms within communities about who should give the consent. And written consent for many people can pose a problem. They feel they're really handing on their lives if they sign something. So it needs to be planned and considered, and the appropriate people consulted in those sorts of situations. Incentives are generally not acceptable, as they may be coercive to potential research participants. And of course, any payment is not to be confused with reimbursement of costs that we talked about before. The recommended format for information and consent forms is available on the Union Ethics Advisory Group website, which is here, and we would strongly suggest that people consult this before writing their forms. What about post-trial provisions? Do researchers have responsibilities for ensuring that any beneficial results are applied or made available? And there are two sides to this. Yes, because they're close to the results and they knew the participants, and no, because service delivery is not the researcher's business. So that's a long discussion in itself. But I would point out some very recent amendments to the World Medical Association Declaration of Helsinki last year, where they specifically say, in clinical trials, sponsors, researchers and governments should make provision for post-trial access for all participants who still need an intervention shown in the trial to be beneficial. So those are strong words, and this requires careful planning and budgeting before the study starts. No good saying, well, there are no funds to provide this vaccine or this drug or this test for a community. It has to be built in. Another aspect highlighted by the recent WMA document is on vulnerable groups. So emphasizing what I already said, that vulnerable groups need to be studied with care. There also, a third amendment, important amendment, is about placebos and the issue of testing new interventions against best proven interventions. And exceptions should only be made if there are no serious risks in not using the best proven interventions, if none exist, or if there are other compelling reasons. But placebos have always been a touchy, important issue. Going back to looking at studies on human participants, are there any risks for research staff? And how are adverse reactions managed? the role of data safety monitoring boards. And finally, I want to just remind you about the International Union Ethics Advisory Group, which reviews all studies where the union or union staff are involved as PIs or collaborators, co-authors of the publication, sponsor or funder. And approval is required even if it's given by or submitted for and awaiting approval another ethics body. And approval can be given and is given pending approval by a local ethics body, but withdrawn if that local approval is not available. That's the website. You may be interested in an 8-year review of the functions of the group, which appeared in Public Health Action. Some common problems, just for your information. Informed consent is always up there, and it's inadequately done. It's too complex, not complete. Community engagement is another weakness. Are people involved in the planning and the results? Local staff not involved as collaborators or co-authors, that's unfair and unethical. And confidentiality issues, collecting names when it's not necessary, and not being sure that all data collectors understand confidentiality. Some references, as I mentioned, that we have found useful and are certainly worth having a look at. Thank you.